If you're a video game collector who's been collecting recently, you'll know that prices of video games haven't necessarily been stable in the past year or so. And you're not imagining things. On average, game prices have increased about 40% over 2019 at their peak. And in the midst of all of this, you saw sealed graded games from WATA sold at heritage auctions for millions of dollars, which prompted a lot of collectors of non-graded games to worry that it was only a matter of time before a loose Earthbound went for thousands. The incredible value leap in graded games from WATA was met with a lot of suspicion from veteran collectors, and that skepticism has been backed up by Karl Jobst's scathing investigative reporting of the matter. And the question remains, is the same thing happening to the non-WATA market? Welcome to Retronomics, the series that follows price trends in video games, and if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend watching Karl Jobst's investigative video about WATA games and the speculative market. It is a well-documented video and confirms a lot of what people like Pat the NES Punk and others have been saying ever since WATA emerged on the video game scene. And in that video, he explained how the market for graded games by WATA is being manipulated in similar ways that other collectible markets have been manipulated in the past. Coins in the 80s, comic books in the 90s, and now video games in the 20s. And with the same players, in fact, involved in each boom. Now, I'm not going to go over everything in this video. I mean, you should watch it for yourself. It's a really great use of an hour of your time. But what I really want to touch on is something that Karl briefly mentions at the tail end of the video, and that's the non-graded market. The stuff that I cover routinely on this channel, so if you like what you see, consider subscribing. It's clear by Karl's video that the WATA graded market is being manipulated to extract that maximum value, and it is really easy to apply that same reasoning to the non-WATA market, but I don't really think that's entirely the case. While Karl's video exposes a long paper trail to back up his claims, it is harder to determine if non-WATA games are being manipulated in the same way, but we can take some elements from Karl's video to see if there's an inkling of manipulation going on to warrant further investigation. And one thing in particular is the speculation graph that he shared from the Tulip and coin prices. And you can see that it has a steady incline, then all of a sudden there's a spike, and then soon after that a crash that lands a little bit higher than what it was before, and then the price proceeds as normal. And if that sounds familiar to you, then congratulations, you've been keeping an eye on my videos and actually video game prices as well. So let's take a look at a couple of games that I've forecasted very recently. Silent Hill 3, Echo Knight, and Einhander. So you can see a resemblance to the graph used in Karl's video. It has like a steady slope, then a really sharp incline, and then it kind of settles back down. It's just not as extreme. So does this mean that the retro video game market is being manipulated? Well, it's really hard to determine if it is, but based on my experience with tracking retro video game prices for over 4 years on this channel, I don't really think that that's the case, and if it is, it's not as widespread as the WATA market. Per Karl's video, the WATA market is maintained by a very small group of people who give the games a grade, go to the media outlets to assign those graded games value, and then sell them via an outlet that they themselves have affiliation with, and are even accused of buying those games themselves to pump the value up in a short amount of time, and you can see that in his video. But the majority of people don't use a traditional auction house like Heritage Auctions. They use eBay, an incredibly convenient way to sell anything from PES machines to a remote control for an incredibly obscure TV set. When you look at eBay, it's way harder to manipulate the market on almost anything. Looking at WATA grades for Super Mario Bros., for example, there are copies being sold for fractions of the cost of their Heritage Auction counterparts, and actually, Heritage Auctions has higher grades, given that they don't seem to sell anything less than a 9.0 sealed, and on eBay we got some 6.5 grades in there, but no Super Mario Brothers is WATA graded higher than an 8.0 that was actually sold. And those really aren't going to make the headlines. Like, you're not going to see that a whole bunch of Mario Brothers sold for $1,000 or something like that when there's one in the headlines that sold for 2.2 million. And when somebody buys these games, they're not going on Pawn Stars to insinuate that the value should be significantly higher. But back to my original point, non-WATA games are not being manipulated like WATA graded games are on Heritage Auctions, at least not on a grand scale. I really have to stress that part though. It's not impossible to manipulate the market, but it is difficult for reasons that I'll go into later in this video. And with that being said, I don't think that there's a company that's pumping a lot of money into the retro video game market to pump up the price of these games. Such a task would require a lot of time, and judging by the prices along with the fees associated with selling these games, it's not really a very efficient investment unless you were able to source all of these games for incredibly cheap. Now, that's not to say that prices aren't affected by speculators. I mean, everybody wants to know what the next big system is so that they can get in before prices get too high. Most people I know don't really keep tabs on how much a game costs once they've purchased it. And based off of the responses to my channel, people are buying these games for their own personal collections so that they can keep them as long as they want and avoid having to pay large sums of money for the same games later on. And I mean, how many of you wish that you can travel back in time to a point where Little Samson or Earthbound were on clearance for $20 or even retail price? Since time travel isn't a reality, you might be inclined to be on the lookout for the next big game at a reasonable price before it really pops off. I picked up Chibi Robo several years ago for $35 because I was aware at the time that it was a hard to find game. And when I came across it, I decided to pick it up. And I still have it despite it being worth almost 7 times as much as my original sticker price. But here's the rub. That took almost 7 years to do so, and it only skyrocketed in the past 2 years. And if you look at games published by From Software, which are games that I've been talking about in my recent Retronomics videos, those games are seeing prices increase way independent of the console's age. Echo Knight for the PlayStation 1 and its sequel Echo Knight Beyond for the PlayStation 2 are seeing increases almost at the same rate of each other. Same with the other titles from the publisher, and it is really hard to tell if people are just buying these games to beat the rush because they know that these games are rare and they're from Software, or if they're planning on selling them at a later time as a form of an investment, which is a pretty bad idea. Either way, I don't really think that it's market manipulation like what WATA is doing. These game prices do seem to be rising organically, and it might be by word of mouth or on forums, and people just want to pick up the game, and if it's a price that they're comfortable paying, then they're going to purchase it. And a game's value is what people are willing to pay for it. And the more demand there is, the more people are willing to pay. But I really don't think that a lot of people are going to be paying $35,000 for a Mario 64 loose cartridge. Game prices tend to be a byproduct of FOMO. You see some game prices starting to take off and suddenly you want to get in before it gets too expensive. I don't think that there is a grand cabal deciding on what the next big console is going to be. And if they do exist, they're doing a really fantastic job of staying hidden. If you were to manipulate the market, you would need to buy all of the copies of a game that, say, Metal Jesus Rocks declares a hidden gem, and then trickle it back into the eBay market at a substantially higher price. And you could theoretically manipulate the market that way, but that's a lot of risk. Number one, you have to continue to scoop up copies lower than what you want your market value to be. And two, you run the risk of being stuck with an unsold stock when the hype around that game inevitably dies down. There are limits to what people are willing to pay for specific titles, but that doesn't stop people from trying. One example of this actually happened very recently when RetroTink came out with the 5X Pro in May, effectively bringing a worthy and available competitor to the fabled out-of-production Framemeister. And before the 5X, a Framemeister was pretty valuable because they were discontinued back in 2019, and some were going for well over the original asking price of $350. And when the 5X became available and it was actually easy to get, for $300, there became a rush by some Framemeister owners to sell theirs before the price eventually bottomed out. Pat Contri mentioned back in May that Framemeisters were being shill bidded for up to $800, something that Karl Jobst actually mentions in his video about WATA auctions, and I'll leave a link in the card so that you can take a look for yourself. But nowadays Framemeisters can be found for around $400, with one selling for $600, but it was like really complete and looked almost unused. But it goes to show you that while market manipulation is possible on eBay, it's not necessarily sustainable, especially when more and more items start to enter the market. And there is this little thing called emulation, not with the Framemeister of course, but most games nowadays can be emulated very close to the original version. Now, I don't typically talk about emulation because somebody in the comments always does, but it is one thing that people will turn to and are turning to when games get too expensive for the physical versions. I've converted my GameCube and Sega Saturn with optical disc emulators, and I have a Lynx, Jaguar, and Virtual Boy flash cards. Now, while they aren't the same feeling as having the physical version of those games on your shelf, they are incredibly affordable if you factor in what prices are going for, and they're a really great way to enjoy retro video games without breaking the bank. But hey, you can't really emulate the experience of a sealed game in a thick acrylic shell, can ya? So that was a quick video about the current state of retro video game collecting markets. Obviously, things are getting expensive and time will tell if they will continue to rise. I do think that the worst is behind us. However, game prices for certain games are likely not to return to pre-pandemic levels, but also you do have pricecharting.com to track those prices so that you can tell for yourself, and also check out my channel because I do make video game forecast videos on a pretty regular basis. So let me know if you buy these games to sell them at a later date, or if you just keep an eye out for deals to avoid having to pay through the nose at a later date. If you like this video, give it a like and share it with those who might find it interesting. And if you're new here, I do a lot of these Retronomic videos with a few other retro related topics sprinkled in between. So subscribe if you haven't done so already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at SnickTendo. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Super Nintendo, and I'll see you next time.